for all kind of, I mean, maybe, but it wouldn't be easy. And of course, who knows what it would lead to. I mean, I think the preponderant opinion among U.S. military and intelligence elements, as far as we can tell, is that it would be a blunder. Not that it's wrong, but that it would be a blunder. It would, harm the position. Iran could respond in Iraq and Afghanistan, and there are American troops there. They could impede the flow of oil, and there might be, who knows what would spread throughout the region. In fact, I'm sure these people read polls. They know that Arab opinion, which at first was quite favorable to Obama, is now so disillusioned that a majority of Arabs say they want Iran to have nuclear weapons. That's pretty astonishing. I doubt if they really do, but I think it's probably a sign of being infuriated with U.S. policy. But a considerable majority now say, yeah, Iran should have nuclear weapons, not just nuclear capability. And who knows what would happen if they bombed. So I think elite opinion, strategic analysts and so on, they're mostly against it. Some of them think it's crazy. But it doesn't mean they're not going to do it. In fact, what I think the most worrisome sign is that Obama is building up pressures which may leave no alternative. Obama is trying hard, U.S. is trying hard to get other countries to accept the U.S. sanctions, not the UN sanctions. They're kind of toothless, so China, except nobody cares, but the U.S. sanctions. And the U.S. is pretty isolated on that. I mean, for example, China just says, don't pay any attention to your sanctions. And the U.S. is just desperate about that. In fact, recently the State Department issued essentially orders to China that that's worth reading. They said, if you want to be accepted into the international community, meaning what we run, you have to meet your international responsibilities. And they are to obey U.S. orders. So in China, they just laugh. We don't obey your orders. And the U.S. can't do anything about it. China's too big to push around. Turkey, right there, has just announced it's going to triple its trade relations with Iran. They've just opened a pipeline to Iran. So is Pakistan. They're not paying attention. I mean, Brazil, the most important country in the South, is very publicly supported Iran's right to develop nuclear, to enrich uranium. And so the entire third world, the non-aligned countries, most of the world, I mean, they've supported it all along, but they don't even exist in Western propaganda, so it's just not people, But when you get to Turkey, Brazil, China, you can't ignore it. In fact, even the European Union, which is very timid and docile, they usually do everything the U.S. tells them, they've announced that they're some hesitant way that they're going to not ignore some of the sanctions. So the U.S. is very isolated on that. And when a powerful state that's used to running things is isolated, it may act irrationally. Furthermore, Obama is building up military forces threatening Iran, and it's not easy to build up extensive military forces and then say, well, I'm not going to use them. The more you build them up, the greater the chance that you'll use them. I think about a quarter of the world's aircraft carriers are now in the Arabian Sea. They're almost all American. And all the super carriers are American. I think maybe one is French, but they're almost all American. Each aircraft carrier is a battle group. The aircraft carrier alone has vast destructive capacity, but it means it's part of a group, battle group. So they're congregating in the Arab Sea, obviously aimed at Iran. The island of Diego Garcia in the Indian Ocean is extremely important. That's the British kicked out the population so that the U.S. could establish a big military base. And it is probably the main base for bombing in the region, the Middle East, Central Asia. Obama has built it up extensively. He's just about a year ago ordered the Navy to establish facilities there for nuclear submarines. Nuclear submarines mean undetectable submarines which carry missiles with nuclear warheads. So that's essentially threatening Iran with nuclear war. No other, and I assume Iranian intelligence must know all about this. Nobody reports it here, but it's public documents. The Bush administration started a program to develop what they're called deep penetration ordnance. It's called bunker buster sometimes. Big bombs that go way down into the ground, only one purpose, Iran. They didn't do much about it, but as soon as Obama came in, one of his first acts was to escalate production of them. They're now coming into use a year or two before it was planned, and he just shipped a couple hundred of them to Diego Garcia. Well, you know, these are very visible threats. And if you just look at the map, I mean, Iran is completely surrounded by U.S. Bases and facilities. So when you build up that, and of course the propaganda is building it up too. You go back a couple of years, 2007, the majority of Americans were opposed to any threats. In fact, their opinions were pretty much the same as Iranians. There was a joint poll of Iranian American public opinion that came out almost the same. I haven't seen a recent poll, but I'm sure if you took one now, it would be totally different. There's been massive propaganda identifying Iran as the major threat to world order. And it's quite interesting to see how, and this is trumpeted all over the place. Well, you know, suppose we had, imagine a free press somewhere. It's impossible to imagine, but let's do a thought experiment. First question they'd ask is, what's the Iranian threat? That's not asked, but it's answered. It's not asked, but it's answered. And that's not reported. We have an authoritative answer. Every year, the Pentagon and intelligence community present analyses to Congress of global security. They did it last April, and of course there was a section on Iran. They make it they're very explicit. They say there's no military threat. They said Iran has very low military expenditures by standards of the region. It has very limited capacity to deploy force. Its strategic doctrine is aimed at holding off invasions. They said if they're developing a nuclear capability, they don't say yes or no, but if they are, it would be part of their deterrent strategy. Well, you know, if any country needs a deterrent, that's the one. That's the military threat. But then they go on to say that, yes, it's the major threat to world order. Why? Because it's destabilizing neighboring countries. It's trying to expand its influence. You can't do that. We own the world. You can't interfere with us. And also, of course, it's supporting terror. And that's interesting, too. The terror that it's allegedly supporting happen to be the winners in the two free elections, relatively free elections that have been held in the Arab world. There's one really free election. That was in Palestine. Hamas won. The U.S. and Israel instantly turned to punishing the Palestinians severely for voting the wrong way. They didn't conceal this. You know, it's the front page of the paper. But those announcements run side by side with our dedication to bringing democracy to the world. Meaning, if you don't vote the right way, it's not democracy. It couldn't have been more explicit. So that's Hamas. And what about Hezbollah? Well, again, it can't be reported here. But in the last election in Lebanon, the Hezbollah-based coalition, March H coalition, got the majority of the votes. About the same as Obama's majority, 53%. We just can't report that. I mean, but in fact, what's reported is that they didn't get the majority of representatives, which is true because of the sectarian system, which reduces the Shiite representation, you know, for all kinds of reasons, going back to the French. So yes, they didn't get the fact that they didn't get most of the representatives is because of the deficiency of the democratic system. But if it had been fully democratic, they'd be running the government. Well, so those are the two terrorist forces. And you can hate them or like them or whatever you say, but the terrorism for which they're blamed is, in the case of Hezbollah, driving Israel out of Lebanon, which incidentally is called Iranian aggression, literally. If Hezbollah guerrilla forces drive Israel out of occupying southern Lebanon in violation of Security Council orders, that's Iranian aggression. And Hamas is resisting what the U.S. and Israel wanted to do. So that's terrorism. I mean, you can find terrorist acts too, but they don't matter. In fact, in comparison with U.S. and Israeli terrorism, they can't even detect them. But that's the Iranian threat. Supporting terror, namely the two major forces that have won in elections, and expanding its influence. And that makes sense, because on the principle that we own the world and that no exercise of sovereignty is permitted that will interfere with our policies, yes, it's a threat. And that principle, incidentally, is official. It goes back to the Second World War, when plans were made to organize the post-war world. The basic plans were we have to establish a global system in which the United States remains dominant, and no exercise of sovereignty can be tolerated which interferes with that. Practically in those words. And a lot of future policy follows from that. I mean, it doesn't work anymore because the world's too diverse. So China doesn't pay any attention, Turkey doesn't, Brazil doesn't, so on. But it's still the policy. And it shows up in the case of Iran. But none of this is discussed. None. I mean, it's discussed on the margins, Z magazine, but you can't find anything in the media or the major journals about this. I mean, obliquely, maybe it's mentioned somehow. But these ought to be the headlines.
So do you think